What's going on? It's Ray with TrueMission.com, and I'm so excited to be with you today. I truly believe God has huge things in store for your life and that your best days are ahead of you. There's an interesting scene that we find in Matthew chapter 19. The disciples have come to Jesus and they're curious about salvation. Now, they're looking around and in their thought, because their tradition had taught them that salvation was on the basis of an outward work. And Jesus is wrecking their theology right now. And so they ask him a question over in verse 25. They say, "Who in the world then can be saved?" And Jesus looks at them intently in verse 26. And he says, "Humanly speaking, it's impossible. But with God, everything is possible." Man, I really want us to get that down in our spirits today. With God, all things are possible. I mean, Jesus is looking at these young men and he's telling them, man's efforts have limits on them, but God's ability is without limit. You serve the God of the impossible. And here's the thing about this God of the impossible that you serve. He has called you to step into the world and be a voice of healing in a fallen and broken world. That means that you're called to step in and share the goodness, the grace, the mercy of God in a world in which people are desperately looking for hope. Well, my hope is that we will expand our belief. We'll expand our understanding of our faith, and that we will step out and be that voice of healing in a broken world. Now, I want to look at another story found over in John chapter 5. A very interesting scene. There's a guy in John chapter 5 who has been sick for 38 years. And so the story picks up in verse 1. Jesus, he's traveling from Jerusalem after a holiday, and he enters in the city through the sheep gate. And there was in this area a pool of Bethesda. Now, this pool had 5 covered porches on it. And crowds of sick people, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed, they all lay on this porch waiting for a certain movement of the water. For an angel of the Lord would come from time to time and stir up the water. And the first person to step in after the water was stirred was healed from whatever disease they had. Now, there was this guy who had been laying there for 38 years. Can you imagine this? For 38 years, he laid staring at the water with the hope of getting in and receiving his miracle in his life, surrounded by a bunch of other people who are desperately staring at the water, hoping for their miracle. He was in a situation in which everyone around him, including himself, was in a condition that it seemed like there was no hope for. And here comes the healer walking through the sheep gate. The healer, he's walking through the crowd, and he locks eyes with this man. The God of the impossible locks eyes with him. The God of the impossible, with just one touch, his healing, the thing that he had been longing for 38 years, could manifest. Jesus locks eyes with this guy. And he walks up and he asks him a very interesting question in verse 6. He looks at him and he says, "Would you like to get well? Would you like to get well?" I mean, if you're the man, put yourself in that man's position. You've been sitting there for 38 years, and here Jesus comes walking up asking the question, "Do you want to be made well?" Well, I've been sitting here for 38 years. I mean, he had been in this condition for a long time. For such a long time that he actually began to identify with the condition. You see, I think sometimes in our lives, we get stuck in a position of brokenness, a position of illness, that we begin to identify with that condition. And Jesus walks up and he asks the man the simple question, "Do you want to be made well?" That is, he's looking at this man and he's saying, "Are you content with staying where you're at? Or do you want the opportunity for change? Because if you don't take this opportunity, it's going to pass you by." It's this voice of the healer that's speaking to all of us, that same voice speaking to all of us today, asking us the question, are you tired of living in the state, in the condition that you're in right now, or do you want to be made well? It's interesting to me because this man responds in verse 7 with a series of excuses. He says, I can't, for I have no one to put me in the water when the bubbles start bubbling up. Somebody always gets ahead of me. You know, this man responds with his excuses. The healer is looking him right in the eyes. And rather than responding to the healer, he begins to give excuses of the reason why he can't get well. But here's the thing that Jesus does in this man's life. He's unconcerned with his excuses. It's as if Jesus is looking at him and saying, if you'll just bend your will, I'll do the rest. It's what Jesus is speaking to all of us. If you'll just bend your will, He'll do the rest. Jesus looks at him and in verse 8, he says, stand up, pick up your mat and walk. Jesus is telling this man to do something different. He's telling him to do something that up until this moment in his life seemed impossible. Now, there must have been fear that had been sounding off in this man's mind. But Jesus is looking at him and he's saying, you've been down for too long. It's time to get up. And I believe that's the same thing that Jesus would say to all of us today. You've been down for too long. It's time to get up. The scripture says in verse 9 that instantly the man was healed. He rolled up his sleeping mat and he began to walk. Man, you've been down for too long. It's time to get up. It's time to pick up your mat and walk on. It's time to be the voice of healing in this broken world that says you don't have to stay down any longer. You don't have to live in that condition any longer. The healer has come to set you free. Your true mission begins in a relationship with Jesus. To find out more about this, check out the video entitled, I'm with Jesus. If you're new to our channel, we upload videos every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on that bell notification. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you soon.